have a word of prayer, then we'll begin. Father, thank you for your grace to us each day, for the great salvation we enjoy through Jesus Christ our Lord. Thank you for CBC, for the fine folks there and the leadership of the church, and bless them in the days ahead. And I pray for Dr. Snowberger that the surgery will go well tomorrow and they'll be able to correct this condition and he can be restored to full health again. Pray for our class tonight that you'll continue to help us as we seek to gain knowledge about this intertestamental period. And we ask all this in Christ's name. Amen. So we're looking at this right now. We're dealing with the rule of the Macedonians. And let me bring up this screen here. And just remember where we're at here. Remember, we're looking at the history of the intertestamental period right now. And we went kind of far back to Israel when it was established as a kingdom under David and then under Solomon. But then the kingdom was divided in 930 BC into Israel in the north, sometimes called Samaria, or but often called Israel, and then Judah in the south, Judea in the south. And this continues until 722 BC. We saw the rise of the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, and then the Grecian Empire. So we saw the Assyrians, and then in 722 BC, the Assyrians came down and took a good part of the population of Israel, at least the governmental class, the richer families, more or less the elites in Israel, took them into captivity back to Assyria. So when we look at, who's dominating Israel, we've got the Assyrian Empire, then the Babylonian Empire, then the Persian Empire, then the Greek Empire. And ultimately, we're actually looking at the independence of the Greeks. We're coming up on that particular part right now. But we had the Assyrians here, and then the Babylonians. They came into power. And they had three really invasions of Judah. Remember, Israel's already taken into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar that comes down in 605 BC, 597, finally in 586. Because Judah rebels, he destroys Jerusalem and the temple. The temple is destroyed, temple built by Solomon. So that's the end of the first temple in 586 BC, and people are taken captive. They're taken captive at different times, 605, 597, 586, the last captivity. And then we come to the Persian Empire, 539 to 333. And the Persians have an extensive empire. They're never able to conquer Greece, remember. We talked about they had various wars. First, Cyrus comes to power, and he allows the Jews to return. He has there are several returns. First, 538 BC, Zerubbabel is allowed to return, remember, and rebuild the temple. And then under Artaxerxes, another Persian, 458, 2,000 men and their families are allowed to return. Ezra becomes the leader there then. He becomes the spiritual but also the political ruler under the Persians. But the walls of the city are in ruins. And so in 445 BC, Nehemiah returns. He's allowed to return, and the city walls are rebuilt. There's a spiritual awakening and so forth. 445 BC. And that brings us to an end of the Persian part of the empire. And it brings us an end to the Old Testament as we know it. The last historical period is the period of Nehemiah and the building of the walls. And then we have this intertestamental period of 400 years that we're talking about. But Israel the Persians lose power, and you can see the Greeks take over that same power, that same area. This is Alexander the Great. He starts off in Macedonia. He's a Macedonian. His father conquers Greece, kind of unites that. And then Alexander goes on his long travel all the way through, what we think of as Turkey today, Asia up here, goes down into Egypt, conquers Egypt. He founds a new city, Alexandria, and then he makes his travel all the way to India, comes back and dies in Babylon. And so after Alexander, we talked about, you remember, there's some fights for a number of years, to a long period, to establish who's going to control his empire. And it's sort of divided up among 4 groups. And the 2 groups that we're interested in are the groups here, this greenish color, the Seleucids, or sometimes Syrians. Now, the important to remember about all these things these are Greeks. The Greeks are in control of this. Now, these people are not Greeks. These are not Greek people. But this is a ruler by Greeks, a Greek dynasty. They marry Greek people, and for hundreds of years they maintain their Greekness. They don't become assimilated into the culture of the other people. They're spreading Greek culture. And down here in Egypt, you have the Ptolemies, and we have these are names after rulers. So the Seleucids, Syrians, then Ptolemies down here. And initially, we talked about the Ptolemies are controlling Israel. They're controlling this area along here, Israel and so forth, down into Egypt. And that's called the Ptolemaic rule that we looked at last time. And we said that under this Ptolemaic rule, the Jews had a pretty good situation. They left the Jews alone. They paid tribute to the Egyptian government, but they were allowed to be governed by the law of Moses. The high priest and a council of elders sort of ruled the Jews. They paid tribute. And so Judaism, flourished pretty much in that particular period, this period of Ptolemaic rule. We said one of the main features that we'll become interested in during that period is that the Bible, the Old Testament, was translated into Greek during that period, around 250 BC, called the Septuagint. We'll talk about that later. And then we are talking about the rule of the Seleucids. And that's where we are right now. Last time we kind of finished up the Ptolemaic rule. And you can see with that chart there, I don't think I have that. But that chart, that in the notes, the Maccabean Hasmonean period, right before the Seleucid rule here, we have that chart of the Seleucid kings and the Ptolemaic kings and the Jewish leaders. And on the right, we see the Ptolemaic kings, and then the Seleucid kings. And then we see Jewish leaders as the Jews established, got independence from the Seleucids. So now we want to talk about the Seleucid rule. These are still Greeks. This is another one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, and they establish their rule in Alexandria, Egypt. And again, it's a Greek rule, Greek culture. Now, it doesn't change Egyptian culture that distinctively. I mean, it's still, but they do try to spread Greek culture and so forth. So we're talking about Seleucid rule 198 to 143 BC. First of all is this Seleucid control, 198 to 168. So here I've got a chart, I have a map, and notice you can see that green is extending, all the way down now into Israel here, to Judah, all along here, because now the Seleucids are in control. And as I mentioned here, the Seleucids had been trying to gain control of this land for a long time. And we won't go into all the history of that, but they tried various means. As I say here, they tried marriages, they tried alliances, they had some small invasions, and so the various Seleucid rulers that are mentioned in that chart there, Seleucus the First and so forth, Antiochus. So this Antiochus that we're going to talk about is a dynastic name. It's a name of a ruler. And so you have Antiochus the First, the Second, the Third, the Fourth, and so on. The city of Antioch gets its name for Antiochus. And there's more than one city of Antioch. You remember in the New Testament, there's Antioch in Syria, the Antioch where Paul was sent out on his missionary journeys. And then the book of Acts mentions another Antioch, sometimes called Antioch in Pisidia, that he preached the gospel on his first missionary journey. So you've got these cities named Antioch. They say there's 16 of them actually, that I guess is kind of like, Washington. There's a Washington, Michigan, a lot of cities named Washington or Jefferson, things like that. Well, the Seleucids, as I say, they tried to gain control until 198 BC. In 198 BC, Antiochus the Third, Seleucid ruler, he defeated Egypt. So they had these battles, these wars, and 198, he's able to defeat Egypt. And the Jews still did pretty well under him. That is, when I say well, he didn't interfere that much with their culture, with their religion, and so forth. So that was good. But then his son comes to the throne. Antiochus the Third. Antiochus the Third was interested in trying to expand his empire, and he we'll talk about this in a moment. But the Romans are coming on the scene now. They're a major power in the Mediterranean area, and we'll talk about shortly here. We'll talk about the Romans and their chief adversary in the Mediterranean were where we'll mention them. They had a series of wars called the Punic Wars, and in these wars they battle various people. But one of the famous people they battle in the Second Punic War was Hannibal, and Hannibal was defeated, but he fled. And he fled eastward. He went into Greece. He tried to take over Greece. The Romans hadn't conquered Greece or anything. These were the Carthaginians, I guess I should have said. So the Carthaginians were in North Africa, and they were chief opponent of the Romans. But the Romans defeated them in a series of 3 wars. The second one, they defeated Hannibal, though he wreaked a lot of havoc in Italy. And he eventually fled east. He went into Greece, and he came east, and Antiochus III formed an alliance with him because he thought, maybe those two together could beat up on the Romans, and then they could take some Roman territory, because Antiochus had hopes for expansion and so forth like that. But ultimately, he was defeated. He and Hannibal were defeated by the Romans, and that was the end of his plans to expand his empire even more. Ultimately, then his well, as part of the ending of that battle, that Romans demanded, they often did this in order to keep their subjects under control. They would demand that the son of the ruler would be held in captivity, and so Antiochus was forced to give up his son Antiochus IV to the Romans. He went to Rome, and for 12 years. Now, he learned a lot about the Romans and so forth and all that. Finally, when his father died, he comes back. He's allowed to come back, and he becomes Antiochus IV. He takes the throne. And he was determined to rid Judah, Israel, of their what he thought were very strange, unusual beliefs, unusual ideas and religion and so forth. Because again, these people were convinced that the Greek way of life, the Greek religion, which is really the Roman religion, their way of life, their customs, this is really the way life should be. And they wanted to enforce that. They wanted to spread that. And then this is called Hellenization. I mentioned here in the notes, Hellenization. And that comes from the Greek word for Greek. The Greek word for Greek is Hellene. So Hellenization is just spread of Greek culture, Greek language, and so forth. And he felt that was really the way to go, and he wanted to. His father hadn't done that, and so forth. Well, he was an egotistical egomaniac. He called himself a Theos Epiphanes, which means God manifest. So he thought himself as the earthly manifestation of Zeus, the head of the Greek pantheon. He said he was the earthly representative and manifestation of Zeus in human form and so forth. And so he was really intent on this Hellenization and getting rid of Greek Jewish culture and so forth. And I mentioned in number 2 there that he let me get rid of that. Need that now. Let's see. He was determined to, as I say here, he was determined to do this, and he started by replacing the high priest. Remember, under Persian control, and then even under the Greeks, the high priest was the ruler. He was the kind of political and religious combined. And he thought, well, the way to get this process going is to replace the high priest with someone more in tune with my ideas. So he replaced the high priest, which was a hereditary office. He replaced the Orthodox high priest, I mentioned here, Onias III, with his brother, Jason, who was more favorable to Greek culture and paid Antiochus more money. Remember, the Greeks were required to pay tribute to the Persians, to the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids and so forth. They paid this tribute, and so Antiochus, he needed money, and he wanted to fight the Romans and so forth. And so he replaced the high priest. Jason Jason itself is a Greek name. It's not a Jewish name. And so as I say, Jason planned to make Jerusalem into a Greek city. And he went about that. He built a gymnasium where you would have athletes exercising, so forth. And they exercised in the nude. In the Greek fashion, men exercised in the nude. And he built a racetrack where there were races and betting and so forth like that. Well, this really outraged, pious Jews. You can imagine. This is so contrary to the Old Testament and the Bible and so forth. But a lot of Jews accepted this and compromised and went along with this Hellenization. A lot of Jewish priests bought into this. I don't know, for political reasons or whatever, or they believed it. They bought into this. This caused enormous, controversies and difficulties in Israel and so forth, in Judah. As I say here, Hellenization included attendance at Greek theaters, Greek dress, surgery to remove the marks of circumcision, exchange of Hebrew for Greek names. We saw one of those, Jason, right there, which is a Greek name rather than a Hebrew name. The Jews that were opposed to this, I mentioned, process, were called Hasidim, meaning pious ones or holy ones. Well, then Antiochus turns around and sells the priesthood again to another Jew named Menelaus. He was a thoroughgoing Hellenist. And Menelaus was not even of the tribe, he wasn't even a Levite. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. So he wasn't, at least Jason was of the right tribe. He was of the priestly tribe, but Menelaus was not even of the priestly tribe. And so Menelaus, was willing to give even more money to Antiochus. And Menelaus, even though he was a Jew, was a thoroughgoing Hellenist. So we've got in Judaism now sort of we might call liberal Jews or Hellenistic Jews, Jews who are willing to go along with this and approve of this process. And then we've got, many who don't. And we've got a whole group of people called the Hasidim who are reacting to this and so forth. The selling of the high priest, to the priesthood to the highest bidder and so forth. So then we have this internal battle. And as I mentioned here, in 170, Jason seized control of Jerusalem from Menelaus. So, we've got political shenanigans going on here, and political infighting, fighting for the priesthood and so forth. Menelaus had put the entire temple treasury at Antiochus's disposal, because Antiochus was again intent on becoming a kind of a superpower, battling the Romans and so forth. Well, that leads to what I call here Antiochus's revenge. Antiochus's revenge. And I'll try to explain that with this kind of map here. At least it's showing some of the things that we'll see here. Antiochus, he's up in Antioch in Syria, and this turmoil is going on down in Israel, and so he's concerned about what's going to happen with the Ptolemies. They're still fighting back and forth. The Ptolemies in Egypt would like to regain the green down here, the Ptolemies. They'd like to regain this land up here, and so they're constantly battling and fighting and so forth. So Ptolemy, Antiochus in 168 BC, as I say here, he has a second attack on Egypt. And he also, this little arrow here is showing he sent a fleet over to capture Cyprus and take that land. Now, all of this was very upsetting to the Romans. The Romans were moving into this area. I'll show that later. They had captured North Africa mostly. They had taken Greece, and they're getting ready to move down here into the Middle East. The Romans are. And, they're trying to see what's happening here with these people battling for this land here, for the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and so forth. So Antiochus the fourth is getting this money. The Romans come in and defeat him in a battle. I won't go into all the details there. But as I say here, when they defeated him, they sent as I mentioned here, a single elderly ambassador to confront Antiochus before he entered Alexandria. So this is kind of a famous scene in history. They defeated him on the battlefield, but he still wanted to try to get into Alexandria and take it. And this Roman ambassador from the Roman Senate came in. He drew a circle around Antiochus, and said, "Don't move out of that circle until you agree to leave, Egypt forever. Are you going to be in big trouble with us?" As I say, Rome was becoming the greatest power. They had defeated the Carthaginians. They had taken control of Greece. And so he drew this circle and said, you got to swear to evacuate Egypt and not come back. Egypt was a very important place. It produced a lot of grains, barley, wheat, and other things like that. When the Romans took it over, this was the main place they got their grain from, actually. It was considered one of the most important province in the Roman Empire outside of Italy itself. It was considered extremely important. And so the Romans wanted to have control of this area. So Antiochus his plans are thwarted, his plans for expansion of his empire, his plans to take Egypt, which he had all the Seleucid rulers had wanted to take this. They felt should be theirs. So I mentioned here on number 2, when Antiochus reached Jerusalem in 167, he comes back. He comes back from Egypt. He goes back to Jerusalem here. Kind of showing it there. When he comes back, I say here, he found that Jason had driven Menelaus out of the city. Remember, these were the two who vied for the high priesthood. Jason, Menelaus. Menelaus was the last one. So Antiochus, as I say, viewed this as a full revolt. He invaded the city, allowed his troops to kill many of its residents, and he ordered a cultic Hellenization in Palestine, which meant he forbade the Jews to keep their ancestral laws, to observe the Sabbath, customary festivals, traditional sacrifices, and the circumcision of their children. So he's just going to wipe out Judaism completely. No circumcision, no festivals, no feasts, no nothing. He ordered that copies of the law be destroyed, destroy the Bible, and so forth. In fact, it was considered a capital offense to be found with a copy of the Bible, of the law. And so he set up idolatrous altars were set up. The Jews were commanded to sacrifice. They were commanded to eat swine flesh. So he was trying to totally rid them of of Jewish worship altogether. As I mentioned here on Kislev, that's a Jewish month, which was December the 25th in 167, the temple of Jerusalem became the place of worship of the Olympian god Zeus. So now the temple is rededicated. Remember, the temple we talked about the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, but the temple had been rebuilt, of course, under Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and then Nehemiah, the walls. And so he wanted a complete Hellenization, destruction of Judaism altogether. And so the temple was dedicated as a temple to Zeus, the Greek god, the head of the Greek pantheon. Swine flesh was altered. You notice these references here to like 1 MACC and 2 MACC. This is a book called Maccabees, and we'll talk about these books a little later. They're part of what's called the Apocrypha, the Old Testament Apocrypha. So there were some books, Jewish books, written by Jews in the intertestamental period. A number of them, 14 or 15 of them written in the intertestamental period by Jews. They were never accepted as scripture by the Jews. They were written by Jews, never accepted by scripture as Jews. But later we'll see the Roman Catholic Church adopted most of those into their canon in the 16th century as part of their Bible. And one of them is Maccabees. Now this book, this first Maccabees, is thought to be a pretty accurate historical account of the period. It's not scripture, but it gives us a lot of the details that I'm talking about here and so forth. And so he sets up the altar there. Sacrifices have to be offered every month and dedicated to him. Because remember, this is the temple of Zeus, but he's the earthly incarnation of Zeus. Antiochus Epiphanes, God Theos, God manifest in the flesh. That's him. Well, you can imagine that none of this went down well with the Jews. They were, finally this results in a revolt. And it's called the Maccabean Revolt. We'll get to that name here in a moment here, but this is the Maccabean Revolt. 167 to 143 BC. What time are we supposed to take a break? 6:40, is that it? 6:40, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's stop right here because I want to, rather than get into the Maccabean Revolt, go ahead and let's take a break for about 15 minutes and then we'll come back, Lord willing, and we'll get into the actual revolt here, Maccabean Revolt. Thanks. All right, we are looking at the Maccabean Revolt. This is 167 to 166, about. So Antiochus has tried to wipe out Judaism completely. As I mentioned here, the revolt starts under a man named Mattathias. I say here, every village in Palestine was ordered to set up its heathen altar, and imperial delegates saw to it that the citizens offered the heathen sacrifices. So this, unbelievable. In the obscure vision of Modin, this is about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. There was a priest there, an aged priest I mentioned here, named Mattathias, who refused to offer a heathen sacrifice when he was ordered to by Antiochus' agent. So Antiochus sent out these, agents to all these villages, and so forth throughout the land to make sure that they were offering sacrifices. Another Jew I mentioned volunteered to offer the sacrifice. Mattathias killed him and the agent. He tore down the altar and he proclaimed, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." That's that first Maccabees again. Mattathias, his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, Jonathan, and many followers fled to the mountains. This marks the beginning of what's called the Maccabean Revolt. This Hasidim that we talked about, these people who had opposed this Hellenization, this religious group, joined in this struggle. So we really have this struggle now against this Hellenization. This Maccabees, and his sons, they are leading this war, really. This is really guerrilla war. So they're fighting battles where they can win. They waged war against the Seleucid, the Syrians, but also against Jews. They fought other Jews who wanted to comply with what the Seleucids did and their policies. So they were fighting Jews and they were fighting the Syrians or Seleucids. I'm using those two terms interchangeably because in the literature they talk about Seleucids or Syrians. They're kind of interchangeable at this point. And so they fought Jews who complied with Antiochus's commands. They tore down these heathen altars that were erected, to worship the Greek pantheon. They got other Jews to join their crusade and so forth. Well, Mattathias, he dies in 166. That's why I have that date, 167 to 166. He dies, and his 3rd son, a man named Judas, takes over and becomes the leader of this revolt. And so that brings us to number 2 there, Judas Maccabeus, 166 to 160. This name Maccabeus comes from a Hebrew word meaning hammer, Judas the hammer. And so that kind of gives the name to the revolt, the Maccabean revolt. I can remember when I first came to Detroit and I was driving up north on Southfield, and then what's that number 10 road called when you cut off there? What's that called? 10? The Lodge? Yeah. When I went along there, I remember seeing a building that said the Maccabean, it had Maccabean on it. A building there in Detroit there, or in Southfield, I guess it was. So this is the Maccabeans, and he was quite a leader. He really proved to be a terror to the Syrians and to these Jews who went along with this Hellenization. People rallied to him and so forth. And even to this day in Judaism, he's a revered person, Judas Maccabeus. So they waged this guerrilla warfare. They planned these battles. They fought the Syrians, and they made a lot of progress. As I say, he won many volunteers to fight for freedom when he defeated the various Syrian governors. The book of Maccabees explains these battles, talks about these battles he won. He defeated various Syrians. What happened at first was the Syrians didn't take the Seleucid Syrians didn't take this all that serious at first. They thought, well, this is kind of a minor, in this time and age, you had all these minor revolts and rebellions, and they didn't take this that serious. They looked upon this as, oh, this is kind of a minor thing. They didn't take it very serious. And these Syrian army guys, would fight these battles. So Judas, in 164, I mentioned here, he captured Jerusalem. 164, he captures Jerusalem. He restored the temple. He selected priests who would remain faithful. He destroyed the altar of the Olympian Zeus. and built a new one there in Jerusalem. So this is a great victory. Exactly 3 years after its desecration, the temple was rededicated on the 25th of Kislev, 164 BC. That was December the 14th. Remember that the Jews have this lunar calendar, and it differs from the solar calendar that we subscribe to. So Kislev 164 is the name of a month, and it was December the 14th that year, but it might be a different date in another year. And they rededicated the temple with a 8-day feast known as Hanukkah. Hanukkah. Hanukkah means dedication. And you've probably seen this for sure. This Hanukkah candle holder. The story goes, and Jewish tradition goes, that when Judas recaptured Jerusalem, Judas recaptured Jerusalem and got these priests installed and so forth, there was only a small amount of oil that had been oil that had been prepared and could be used for the menorah, in the temple. Remember, the temple has this menorah, this candle thing that's lit in the temple. There was just a very small amount of sacred oil to light this thing. And according to this story, through a miracle, this oil lasted 7 days until they could get more oil, sacred oil that had gone through the process of being cleansed and everything, So there was this sort of 8-day miracle, according to the story. The oil, even though it was a small amount, they would pour it in there, keep it, lit, the menorah, and there was always more oil there, just, through this miraculous giving of this oil. And so this feast is celebrated today. Now, this is not a feast, of course, in the Old Testament, but it's celebrated around Christmas. So when we celebrate Christmas, the Jews, Orthodox Jews or whatever, others, celebrate Hanukkah. And they celebrate it, and it comes at different times. It might come as early as late November, but usually December. And occasionally it falls on December, the 8th day, or fall on December 25th. It's 8 days. And usually Jewish children get a present each day. So it's it's better than Christmas in that sense, and a gift each day. And so what they do is they have the center here is lit, and this is a candelabra. So there's a candle here in the center, and then each day it's used to light another candle. So these are all whole candles, 9 candles. So there's 8, one for each day of Hanukkah. And this one is lit, and then the first day, the second day, third day, fourth day, right, 8 days of Hanukkah. This Hanukkah candelabra is lit. And that feast is celebrated, as you know, even today by Orthodox Jews. They'll celebrate Hanukkah. And it means dedication, but of course it's not, as I said, a feast. Technically, it's not a prescribed feast by Old Testament law or anything. It's just a tradition that goes back to the Maccabean revolt. Well, the next I should say about Judas. Judas was killed in a battle with the Syrians. Remember, he was fighting them in 160 BC. He was killed in a battle, and at the same time, there was a temporary truce struck with the Syrians. This is because Antiochus the Fourth had died, and so there was turmoil in Antioch and the Syrian Empire, the Seleucid Empire. There was some turmoil there, and so they established kind of a peace. Turned out to be a temporary peace, but still a peace for a while. Judah was still under Syrian control officially. It wasn't. I mean, Judas was fighting, and so the Syrians still controlled it, but they established a peace, temporary peace here for a while this turmoil was going on. And that leads us then to another brother whose name is Jonathan. Now, if you notice this map here, it's got different colors. And the green here, this green area here, Jerusalem in the center, this green area is the area that Judas Maccabeus was able to gain control of. So through his various battles and so forth, they took control of this area right here in the green. Now, ultimately, they'll get control of all this area here, the Maccabees will. Well, when Judas is killed in battle, his brother Jonathan is this light blue here, and it's hard to distinguish because that's kind of purple here. So there's some light blue here, right here, that we'll see. So I mentioned here, after the death of Judas, his brother Jonathan, that was the youngest son, became the leader. The Hellenists who supported Syria had regained temporary control after Judas' death. So there was this, I'm leaving out a lot of history here, but there was this truce for a while, kind of a peace for a while. But there's a division among the Jews. There's people who follow the Maccabees. So the Jews, as we're going to see, are divided into two groups. Some people want to follow the Seleucids. That is, they want to adopt this Hellenization, this liberalization of Judaism. They don't want this Orthodox Judaism and so forth of the Old Testament. Well, they become like, political parties. They become two groups, two powerful parties, and they battle each other now, back and forth for 100 years. And as I say here, the Hellenists who supported Syria regained temporary control after Judas' death, but Jonathan gained increasing power by diplomacy. I won't go into all that. But he played Syria and Rome against each other until he was named high priest and governor of Judea. So the Romans, remember, they're advancing on the scene as we talked about, and they don't want the Seleucids to become too powerful. They see this revolt taking place. They want to use this to their advantage. And so he's able to negotiate. Jonathan is able to negotiate kind of a position here of power, and he is named high priest and governor of Judea. So now we see the political, the priestly power and the ruling power together. The Roman Senate declared itself friend of Judea in 143 BC, or 140 BC. No, about 145 BC, I should say. So Rome it's not because they love these people, it's because they want to say, hey, you're our friend. They're telling the Seleucids, don't touch these people. watch what you do, because this little Judea is our friend. We're friends with them. We're kind of like a treaty or something, you know. And so this gives them kind of a legitimacy. They're still under ultimately Seleucid control, but they have a friend here in Rome at least. Now, again, they're battling. They're fighting. They're fighting the Seleucids. I'm not leaving out all these battles. They're fighting each other. And Jonathan is eventually killed in 143 BC in a battle. So he comes to an end. But then that brings us to their independence. Ultimately, these people, these Maccabeans, are able to establish, this revolt is able to establish itself independently as a country again. And this is called the Hasmonean period. From 142 to 63 BC. This is a Simon. And if you look on this map, it says conquest of Simon. There's not much there. Excuse me. There is this little yellow area here, Joppa and so forth like that, gains a little territory, but not a particular large amount. But I mentioned here, Simon is the second oldest of Matthias's sons. And so he succeeds his brother Jonathan in 143 BC. They gain independence from Syria in 142 BC. Ultimately, they're fighting, they're battling, and they come to where Syria has to recognize Judea as an independent entity. I say the yoke of the Gentiles over Israel had been removed for the first time since the Babylonian captivity. And Judea's political independence meant that they could write their own documents and treaties. This is again according to the book of First Maccabees. Simon made a peace treaty with Rome and Sparta. Sparta was sort of the Greek power then, which guaranteed freedom of worship. Commemorating Simon's achievement, the Jews in 140 BC made him leader and high priest forever. The high priest was made hereditary with him and his descendants, thus established a new dynasty known as the Hasmoneans, a name thought to be derived from an ancestor of the Maccabeans. So now we have the establishment of an independent Jewish state again, for the first time since the Babylonian captivity. And of course, as you can see from that date, 63 BC, this ends in 63 BC, and the Jewish state's not established again until 1948, in a sense, along 1900, 2,000 years, really, before it's established again. There's a lot of intrigue here, a lot of palace intrigue. Simon had a son-in-law named Ptolemy, and he was very ambitious. He was trying to gain power, and he murders Simon, and he murders two of his sons. And he tried to kill his remaining son, a guy named John Hyrcanus, but he escaped, and through a series of intrigues and so forth, John Hyrcanus becomes the leader. He inherits this title of leader and high priest forever. So that brings us to the next guy in the chain, John Hyrcanus. Excuse me, my throat's getting dry here. As I say, John Hyrcanus succeeds his father as high priest and ruler of the people. Before long, he had trouble because Antiochus VII, excuse me, remember the Syrians are still in this ruler of Antiochus the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, He tried to reassert his rule over Judea. He seized Joppa. He besieged Jerusalem for more than a year. And so Judea for a while was under foreign control. Eventually, Antiochus died in a battle against the Parthians in 128 BC. I mentioned here the Parthians. They're a group of people in this area who become ultimately quite powerful. The Romans, here's the Parthian Empire, and the Parthians eventually push through here and take over most of the Seleucid Empire. And during the Roman period, the Romans are fighting the Parthians quite a bit. They're battling because they're in control of this area, and they're fighting the Parthians quite a bit. Um, so I say the Syrian Empire went into decline, and Hyrcanus regained his independence. Hyrcanus renewed the alliance with Rome, whereby Rome confirmed his independence and warned Syria against intervention into Hyrcanus' territory. He was able to expand his territory to include Samaria and Idumea. So we're talking here about this sort of orange color here. So he has all this territory here, the blue, the yellow, this blue over here, but he's able to gain Samaria up here, Samaria, this territory, and he's able to gain this non-Jewish territory here, certainly Idumea. Now this has a lot of significance, Idumea does, for the Jews, because it's from Idumea that Herod the Great comes. Herod the Great is really an Idumean. Now he is also a Jew in the sense of religiously a Jew. The Jews, when they took over this territory, they demanded that all the men be circumcised or leave. So when they took over a territory, they demanded that these people become Jews. That's true in Samaria too. Of course, Samaritans themselves were already sort of following Jewish law, so they were following circumcision, but the Idumeans were made to be circumcised and become Jews in a sense, give up their old religion. And so that's what Herod will, get Herod the Great. We'll talk about him later, but he's already a Jew in a sense. He's Jewish by religion background because his ancestors are forced to become Jewish. Now, during this period, 135 to 104, John Hyrcanus period, this is where we first learn about the two important parties in the New Testament, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees evolved from these Hasidim. Remember, we talked about this initial opposition to the Hellenization under Antiochus IV. The Hasidim, the pious ones, they were religious people who joined with the Maccabees in their fight. And they are a religious party, and they eventually become what we call the Pharisees. The Hellenists, that is, these people who didn't oppose the Syrians, the Jews who wanted to go along with Hellenization to a certain degree. They didn't want the exact religion of a more liberal kind of Judaism. They evolved into the Sadducees. So these people who fought each other, we talked about, the Jews fought among themselves. The Maccabees had to fight other Jews who opposed them. Well, this is where we, according to Josephus and the Book of Maccabees, they ultimately emerged into these two parties, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And now this physical battle between them comes to an end because Syria is forced to recognize Judea as a independent state country, and therefore they don't oppose the Hasmonean dynasty anymore because Syria has recognized them. So, Syria, they're not Syria is not going to try to remove the Hasmonean dynasty, that is Simon, John, Hyrcanus. They're not going to try to remove them. They recognize them now finally, and so the Hellenists no longer oppose the Maccabees. What they're going to try to do is to get control of this government. They sort of got left out here because the Hasidim, the conservative party, is with the Maccabean rulers, and this is what happens. So John Hyrcanus he's aligned with the Hasidim and the Pharisees. And originally, he is a Pharisee himself. He identifies with the party of the Pharisees. But the Pharisees become disenchanted with him because he's becoming secular in their eyes. I mean, you can imagine this is happening. He's an earthly ruler. He's controlling large territory. He's got money. He's got power. And so he becomes more secular himself. And the Pharisees are upset with him. They don't like the idea that he is held onto this title of high priest. The high priest is supposed to be a separate religious title passed down to the tribe of Levi and all this kind of stuff. But he's still holding, even though he's defeated the Syrians now, okay, let's go back to the Old Testament religion. And he says, no. He's holding on to the high priesthood, and he's the ruler. And the Pharisees don't like that, so he switches sides and joins the Sadducees. And so what we're going to see now is a battle between these two parties for control of the government, really, in a sense. So John Hyrcanus has a 31-year rule, and he dies peacefully. Things are kind of stable there for now. In 104 BC, I'm sorry, he dies, and he leaves 5 sons. And that leads us to his eldest son, a man by the name of Aristobulus the First. And maybe I should mention this here. Oh, no, don't do that. As I say, he was the son of Hyrcanus and a ruthless Hellenist. So remember, Hyrcanus had gone over to the Sadducees. He was, here we have the Maccabees who fought against Hellenization. They fought against they fought against this Hellenization, and now their ruler is a Hellenist completely. He's opposing the religion of the Old Testament here. As he's a ruthless Hellenist who preferred his Greek name to his Hebrew one, Judah. And we start seeing this kind of thing. I was going to mention this because we see it in the New Testament, that during this period, and even before this period, a lot of Jews started taking on a more Gentile name. And, this was at first a sign of rebellion or revolt. You're revolting against that kind of thing. But later it just becomes a common thing to do, that people commonly would have a Hebrew name, but they would also have a Gentile name. We see that. I just mentioned some names in the New Testament, like John and Mark. John is his Hebrew name. Mark is his Gentile name. His name is not John Mark. I have a brother-in-law who's named John Mark, but his name was not John. His name was either John or it was Mark. Simeon, who's called Niger, Jesus, who's called Justus, and then we have Saul and Paul, of course. So Paul had this name. He had a Hebrew name Saul, but from his birth, because he was a Roman citizen, he had the name Paul or Paulus in Greek. He had a Roman name. But this practice kind of starts here, and Aristobulus, he has this Greek name. Aristobulus is a Greek name. His Hebrew name was Judah, and he was thoroughgoing Hellenist, say here. I mentioned Hyrcanus had wanted his wife to head the civil government, while his eldest son Aristobulus I would be high priest. Disagreeing, Aristobulus imprisoned his mother, who died of starvation, and imprisoned all his brothers except Antigonus, who shared his rule until Aristobulus had him killed. So, a pretty wicked guy, right? Aristobulus conquered Galilee and compelled the inhabitants to be circumcised. So, here's that map again. So now here we have Aristobulus in this pink color here, and now they've got Galilee. So they've got Galilee up here, Samaria down here, and everything down here, all this land down here, all this over here, all this. So they're expanding this kingdom of Judah or Judea, all in this area. And just like the Idumeans were forced to be circumcised, so the Galileans, people who live there, are forced to be circumcised, compelled to be circumcised. Now, he was the first of this dynasty to call himself king. Before this, people like John Hyrcanus, Simon, were the leader and high priest, but they didn't use the title king. But now Aristobulus uses the title king. Well, this really infuriated the Pharisees because he was not in the line of David. They're not opposed to a king because we had kings in the Old Testament, but he's not in the line of David, and so this infuriates them. His predecessors had just used the title high priest. They were the leader and high priest, and this really infuriates the Pharisees. So you're going to have this struggle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees that carries over to the New Testament, you can imagine. You know how they're opposed to each other? Well, this starts back 100 years before the New Testament age here. Aristobulus is said to have died from unknown disease. There are different rumors about how he died and so forth like that. But he rules until 103 BC. Not long. Well, that brings us to we have a few more here till we get to Rome's intervention here. So why don't we stop here for tonight at this point, because it is 7:29 plus here. And Lord willing, we will see you all next week.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you so much. You too. Have a good week. Stay safe. Don't get too cold up there in cold country.